The engines were heard before they were seen. It started as a low tremor in the asphalt, the kind a man feels in his knee before he hears it in his ears. The mourners gathered outside the small white chapel on Halsey Road, turned their heads toward the highway, toward the sound rolling in from the west, like weather. The funeral director, a thin man named Owen Pratt, who had buried half the town and never once raised his voice, stepped out onto the gravel and stopped cold. Down the long flat road, under a sky going copper at the edges, a column of motorcycles came on in a disciplined 2-by-2 formation that stretched farther than he could count. Chrome caught the last of the light. The riders wore black leather, and on the back of every cut was a patch he did not recognize and would never forget. 75 of them he counted later. Twice, because no one believed him the first time. They were not there for trouble. They were there for a man named Walter Brennan, 68 years old, retired from the county sheriff's department for 9 years, a widower who lived alone at the end of a dirt lane with a deaf old dog and a porch that needed paint. Most of the people inside that chapel had known Walt their whole lives and could not have told you a single remarkable thing about him. He fixed his own fence. He brought soup to the Hendersons when their boy was sick. He had arrested a few of their cousins decades ago, and somehow stayed welcome at their tables anyway. He was the kind of man a town forgets it is leaning on until the day he is gone. He had fixed the steps of the chapel he would be carried out of 2 summers back on a Saturday, without being asked, because he had seen Owen Pratt's mother nearly turn an ankle on the loose one. He had taught half the county's teenagers to parallel park in the empty lot behind the feed store. He had stood in a lot of kitchens over a lot of years and said the plain, true thing that needed saying, and then left before anyone could thank him. People liked Walt the way they liked the sound of a river they had lived beside their whole lives, which is to say, they did not think about it at all until the day it went quiet. He had been gone 4 days. Owen Pratt watched the formation slow, watched it peel into the chapel lot with a precision that belonged to soldiers, and he understood that he was looking at the answer to a question the whole town had been asking since Tuesday. Why had the phone at the funeral home not stopped ringing? Why had strangers been driving past the chapel since dawn? Why a florist 3 counties over had sent a wreath with no card? Something had happened in the last hours of Walter Brennan's life that none of his neighbors knew about. These men knew. They had come to say it out loud. To understand why 75 riders crossed 3 state lines to stand at the grave of a retired cop, you have to go back 11 days, to a stretch of county route where the trees lean close and the light dies early. It was the last week of October, and dusk came down fast and cold. The light that time of year did not so much fade as fall, dropping out of the sky in the space of 20 minutes and leaving the county roads in a blue dark that headlights barely cut. Walt had been out past the reservoir checking on a culvert that flooded the Pruitt place every autumn, a thing the county was supposed to do and never did, a thing Walt did himself because he had checked it for 30 years and could not stop now that no one paid him to. He was driving home in his old truck with the heater that only worked on the highest setting, so the cab was either freezing or roaring, and he had it roaring. He was not looking for anything. He was thinking about supper, about whether there was enough of the stew left or whether he would open a can, about the dog who would be waiting at the door with his bad ears and his good nose. He came around the long curve below Miller's orchard, where the road dropped into a gully and the shadows pooled thick under the leaning trees, and his headlights swept across something in the gravel at the shoulder that did not belong there. He had driven that curve 10,000 times. He knew the exact shape of it in every season, the way the runoff cut the shoulder, the place where the guardrail had been bent since the Carter administration. So the thing in his headlights registered before his mind had named it, the way a wrong note registers, before you know which one. A motorcycle down on its side. A man down beside it. Why? Walt had been retired 9 years, but a body does not forget 31 years of stopping. He pulled the truck onto the shoulder, killed the engine, and was out the door before he had finished deciding to be. The cold hit him. The smell of spilled gasoline hit him next, sharp and dangerous in the still air. He moved toward the shape on the ground the way he had moved toward 100 wrecks, slow and certain, hands already reading the scene. The man was big, easily 240 pounds, and he was wearing leather, a cut, scarred and weathered, with a patch Walt did not recognize. A winged skull worked in faded white thread over a rocker that read, Iron Covenant. One leg was bent wrong beneath him. The boot turned at an angle. A living leg does not turn. There was a dark slick spreading from his thigh into the gravel. Black in the failing light, whiter than Walt liked. His face had gone the gray of old ash. He was conscious, barely, and when Walt knelt beside him, the man's eyes rolled toward him and tried to focus and could not quite manage it. Don't, the man said. His voice came out wet and thin. Don't call it in. Walt had already pulled the flannel shirt off his own back. The cold bit into him in his undershirt, but he did not feel it. He folded the flannel into a thick pad and pressed it hard against the leg, leaning his whole weight down through his arms into the wound, and the man made a sound like an animal caught in a fence. You're losing blood faster than you think, Walt said, calm as a creek over stones. I'm not going to argue with a dying man about his pride. What's your name? The man's jaw worked. The effort of it stood out on his neck. Tully, he managed. All right, Tully, you keep your eyes on me. You hear those engines in your chest yet? Good. Then you're still here. Stay that way. What Walt did not say, because there was no time and no breath to spare on it, was that he understood exactly what the man was asking. He had spent 3 decades learning the difference between people who did not want help and people who could not afford to be found. Tully wore the cut of a club, and the cut meant that an ambulance meant a police report, and a police report meant questions, and questions meant a world Tully had spent his whole life staying one step ahead of. Walt had been the man asking those questions once. He had filled out those reports in his own square hand. He knew precisely what he was being asked to set aside, and he knew the weight of it, and he made the decision in the space between 2 breaths. He set it aside. There was no cell signal in the gully. There never had been. Walt had complained about it to the county for years, back when complaining to the county was his job, so he did the only thing left to do. He got his arms under a man 60 pounds heavier than himself, and with the kind of grunting, undignified, knee-popping effort that no one was there to see, he dragged Tully across the gravel and lifted him into the cab of the truck. It took everything he had. He felt something tear in his own shoulder and ignored it. He drove with one hand clamped on the makeshift bandage and one hand on the wheel, talking the whole way, telling a half-conscious stranger about the culvert and the orchard and the dog at home, anything to keep the man's eyes open. He did not drive to the hospital. He drove to Doc Esther Vance, a veterinarian 3 miles up the ridge who had stitched half the hunting dogs in the county and asked no questions of anyone. Walt had known Esther for 20 years, since the night she had set the leg of a stray he had picked up off the highway and refused to take a dime for it. She came to the door in her robe with her gray hair loose, took one look at the man bleeding in the passenger seat of Walt's truck, and did not waste a single breath on whether she should. That was Esther. The whole county knew that what came through her door at night stayed behind it. "Get his other arm," she said, and the two of them carried Tully into her clinic, a low cinder-block building that smelled of antiseptic and wet fur, and they laid him on the steel table where she usually worked on retrievers. She snapped on the surgical lamp. The white light made the blood look blacker. She cut the jeans away with shears, and her face did the thing a professional's face does when it sees something bad and decides not to show it. "How long ago?" he said. 20 minutes, maybe 25, and you packed it the whole way." "One hand on it the whole way." She worked in silence for a long stretch, her hands moving with the unhurried speed of someone who has done a hard thing many times, and the only sounds in the room were Tully's ragged breathing and the tick of the clock over the door and the small, wet sounds of her instruments. After a while she spoke without looking up. "Femoral's nicked, not cut," she said. "If it was cut, he'd already be gone, and you'd be driving a body. Whoever packed this packed it right, kept the pressure where it needed to be." "That was me," Walt said. She glanced up at him then, over the top of her glasses, her hands still working below. "Then you saved his life on the side of the road, Walter. The rest of this is just sewing." She bent back to it. "Sit down before you fall down. You're gray as he is." That was the first thing. It would have been enough, on its own, to earn Walt a debt. A man does not forget the stranger who chose his life over a clean conscience. Yet it was not the end of what Walt did that night. And the part that came after was the part that would one day bring 75 engines rolling in from the west to a small white chapel on Halsey Road. 'Cause while Esther worked, Tully surfaced. The blood loss had made him loose and honest, in a way he never would have been otherwise, the way a man gets when the floor of him has dropped away, and the careful walls he keeps have nothing left to stand on. Lying on that steel table with a vet stitching his leg and a stranger sitting beside him, he started to talk, low and broken, in pieces Walt had to fit together. He talked about the man who had run him off the road. He had not laid the bike down on a slick of leaves or a patch of gravel. A black truck, newer than Walt's by 20 years, had come up fast and silent behind him on the curve and clipped his rear wheel clean and kept going without so much as a flare of brake lights. Tully had felt the back end go and had time to see the grill fill his mirror before the road came up at him, and he had known in that half-second that it was no accident, because the man driving it had been threatening him and his brothers for a month. "He wants the river," Tully said. His eyes were on the ceiling far away. "He's wanted it a year. We told him no." "You tell a man like that no, he doesn't hear a no. He hears a price he hasn't met yet." "What's his name?" Walt said quietly. Tully told him. The man's name was Gerald Lindquist. Walt knew the name. Everyone in 3 counties knew the name. Gerald Lindquist owned the development company that had been buying up the riverfront, the man whose face was on the billboards by the interstate, the man who had given the new wing of the county courthouse and got his name carved over the door for it. He sat on 2 boards. He golfed with the district attorney. He was, by every official measure that the town used to measure such things, untouchable. And he wanted the land that Tully's club had owned for 30 years. It was a strip of riverbank east of town, 12 acres of scrub and gravel, and an old metal-roofed clubhouse that the club had bought outright in the 80s when nobody wanted it. Now, the river was fashionable. Now, Lindquist's glass renderings showed condominiums. Where the clubhouse stood, he had offered to buy. The club had declined. He had offered more and threatened, and then the offers had stopped. A fire that the marshal ruled, electrical, a run of citations that appeared from nowhere. And now, a truck on a dark curve. He thinks we'll fold, Tully said, his voice fading as Esther tied off the last suture. He thinks we're just a bunch of old men with bikes. He's got the law. He's got the paper. He's got everybody. Walt sat down on a stool beside the table. His torn shoulder throbbed. He was 68 years old, and he had pulled a stranger out of a gully and driven him to a vet, and he was tired in a way that went past his bones, and yet something in him had woken up, something that had been asleep for 9 years. No, Walt said. He's got most of everybody. Here is the thing the town did not know about Walter Brennan, the thing that would matter more than anything else. When Walt retired, he had not retired clean. 31 years a deputy in a small county teaches a man where things are buried, and Walt had spent the last 6 of those years quietly disgusted by something he could not prove. He had watched permits get approved that should not have. He had watched a fire investigation get closed in a day. He had watched a man named Gerald Lindquist's projects sail through a county process that snagged everyone else. And he had started in his last years on the job keeping copies. Not for any plan, just because it galled him, and because keeping a record was the one thing a powerless man could still do. The copies were in a banker's box in his closet, under a stack of his late wife's quilts, and he had not looked at them in years. He looked at them that night. He brought Tully back to the dirt lane at the end of the road, eased him down onto the couch, with a pillow under the bad leg and the deaf old dog for company, and then he went into the bedroom and stood a long while in front of the closet. The quilts were his wife's. She had made them in the last years before she went, and he had not moved them in 9 years, and lifting them off the box was its own small grief. Underneath was the banker's box, the cardboard gone soft at the corners. He carried it to the kitchen and set it under the bare bulb over the table and sat down and went through it one folder at a time. The bulb hummed. The dog snored on the couch. Tully drifted in and out, and the picture that came together on Walt's kitchen table over the next 2 hours was uglier than even he had guessed, while he was living through it one piece at a time. The fire that took the bait shop downriver ruled electrical in a single day, clearing the parcel Lindquist's shell company bought 4 months later. The county inspector who signed off on a seawall that should never have passed, and whose daughter then collected a scholarship from a foundation with Lindquist's name carved into its letterhead. A zoning variance that appeared overnight for a project that had been dead in the water. A pattern, 11 years deep, of a man using the machinery of an honest county, the way another man would use a private tool, oiled and quiet and always reaching for the thing he wanted. Walt had collected all of it for no reason he could have named at the time. He had simply been galled in his last years on the job by a thing he could see and could not stop, and the keeping of a record had been the one act left to a man with no other power. He had told himself he would do something with it someday. Someday had been a way of saying never. The box had sat under the quilts gathering the particular silence that unfinished things gather. It was not enough to arrest anyone. Walt knew that better than a layman ever could. A box of photocopies and a retired deputy's gut were not a case, and they never would be. What they were was enough to do something else. It was enough to make an untouchable man afraid, if it landed in the right hands, all at once. In a way he could not quietly buy back or bury. Walt did not have those hands. Tully's club did. Over the next 8 days, while his leg healed enough to limp on, Tully stayed at the end of the dirt lane and made calls from Walt's kitchen phone, the old kind bolted to the wall with a cord that reached just to the table. The club he rode for was not large, and it was not the kind that made the news, but it had something Lindquist's money could not buy. which was a long memory, and a wide net of men who owed each other things that had nothing to do with money. They came in twos and threes up the dirt lane. In the evenings, big, quiet men who wiped their boots on Walt's porch and called him Sir, without irony, and sat at his table drinking his coffee while they pieced it together. One of the younger members did the heaviest work. He was a lean, soft-spoken man called Peg, who fixed computers for a living in a strip mall 2 towns over, and who wore the cut over a button-down shirt like a man living in 2 worlds at once. Peg sat at Walt's table for 3 nights running with a laptop and the banker's box, and he photographed every page in it, and then he went looking for the threads that the photographs only hinted at. "Here," Peg said on the second night, turning the laptop so Walt could see. "The bait shop fire, your file says." The marshal called it electrical and closed it in a day. But the parcel sold 4 months later, and look who bought it. He scrolled. "Shell Company, and look who's behind the shell." Another scroll. "Took me an hour. The county never looked, because nobody asked the county to look." "That's how it works," Walt said. "Nobody asks. The not asking is the whole machine." Peg found the Foundation's filings, the public ones nobody read. He found the inspector's daughter's scholarship, and the date it was awarded, 11 days after her father signed off on a seawall that should have taken a month of review. He cross-referenced dates that the county had never bothered to line up, because no one with the power to line them up had ever wanted them lined up. He built on a folding chair at a dead man's kitchen table over 8 nights the case that the county had spent 11 years failing to build. "It's not enough to arrest him," Walt told them, the lawman in him still careful even now. "A box of copies and a tired old deputy's gut is not a case. Any lawyer he's got would have it thrown out by lunch." "It's not for a courtroom," Tully said from the couch, his bad leg propped up. "It's for daylight. He spent his whole life making sure nothing ever happens all at once. So we make it all happen at once." And then they did the thing that institutions can never do, because institutions move slow and can be bought along the way, one delay and one favor at a time. They moved all at once. On a Thursday morning, copies of the whole picture arrived on 11 desks at the same hour. The state attorney general's office, 2 hours away in the capital, which owed Lindquist nothing and golfed with no one local. 3 regional newspapers. A federal agency that cared a great deal about how charitable foundations spent their money. And the town's own small weekly, run out of a storefront by a woman named Della Hart, whom Lindquist had never once thought worth threatening, which turned out to be the most dangerous oversight of his life. By noon, the questions Lindquist had spent 11 years buying his way out of were being asked by people he could not reach in offices where his name opened no doors. By Friday, the district attorney who golfed with him had stopped returning his calls, because a man whose name has suddenly surfaced in 11 inboxes at once is a man no friend wants to be photographed beside. The machine that had moved so smoothly for so long, always one quiet favor at a time, could not handle the load of everything arriving together. It seized. And a man who had built his whole life on the machinery moving for him stood and watched it stop. Walt watched it happen from his porch, drinking coffee from the chipped mug he had used for 20 years, the dog asleep at his boot in a square of weak November sun. He did not gloat. That was not in him, and the men who knew him best would say later that the absence of any gloat was the truest thing about him. He had simply put a true thing in front of people who could not unsee it, and stepped back and let the truth do the work that 31 years of his own quiet anger never could. Tully sat beside him on the porch, step-legs stretched out, and the two of them did not say much. There was not much that needed saying. Somewhere down the river, an armored man was beginning to understand the exact thickness of his armor, and on a quiet porch, two men watched the leaves come down and let him learn it on his own time. He should have had years to enjoy it. He had 11 days. On the 2nd of November, Walt's torn shoulder, which he had never had looked at, was the least of what was wrong with him. He had been short of breath for a week and had told no one. He drove himself to the clinic on a gray morning. And somewhere on the county route, on the same curve below Miller's orchard where he had found Tully, his heart simply stopped. The truck rolled gentle off the shoulder and came to rest against the same gravel bank. There was no other vehicle. There was no foul play. The coroner was certain. And for once in this story, the official certainty, a heart that had carried a heavy man up a ridge 11 days before, had finished what it had to give. He was found by a farmer at dawn. The news moved through town the way news moves through small places, quiet and total. By evening, everyone knew that Walt Brennan was dead, and almost no one knew why. A stranger named Tully had been seen on his porch, or why the case against Gerald Lindquist had broken open the week before, or what those two facts had to do with each other. Tully knew, though. He had sat on that porch and watched the man come and go, had eaten at his table and slept under his roof, and seen the banker's box opened under the bare bulb. He knew the whole of it, every piece, and he understood that the town was about to bury a man without ever learning what he had been. He would not let that stand. And so Tully made one more call. The morning of the funeral came in cold and clear, the sky scoured to a hard blue, and the frost still white in the shadows of the headstones. The chapel on Halsey Road held maybe 90 people, and it was full by 10, with more standing in the vestibule and out on the steps in their good coats, with their breath showing. The town came. It came the way a small town comes to bury one of its own, in pressed shirts that did not fit the way they had, carrying casseroles for afterward the men, shaking hands too hard, and the women holding each other's arms. The Hendersons came, the whole family. The boy Walt had brought soup to, now grown with a boy of his own. The Pruitts came, whose culvert he had checked 100 autumns, who had not understood until this week that the reason their place never flooded was a man driving out in the dark with a heater that only worked on high. Esther Vance came in a dark coat with her gray hair pinned up, and she sat in the third row and looked at her own folded hands and said nothing to anyone about a steel table and a stranger's leg. Owen Pratt had the casket polished to a deep shine and the flowers banked along the rail and the small, sad machinery of a country funeral oiled and ready to roll. It was going to be an ordinary goodbye for a man. The town had spent 40 years taking quietly for granted. And then, at 10:30, the engines came in from the west. 75 motorcycles, in formation, riding for a man. Most of them had never met. They had come because one of their own had bled out into the gravel of a dark curve, and a stranger had chosen him over an easy night. They had come because that same stranger had handed them the means to save the ground their fathers had bought. They had come because in a world where the people with badges and billboards had spent 11 years failing the powerless on purpose, one old man with a banker's box had done the opposite, quietly, expecting nothing, and then had died before anyone could thank him. They came to thank him. Anyway, the formation filled the chapel lot, and then the road beyond it. The riders dismounted and stood, and the town stared, and for a long moment nobody knew what was supposed to happen. Then the oldest of them came forward. He was a heavy-set man, well past 60, with a full gray beard and rings worn thin on his fingers, and a stillness about him that made the whole lot go quiet. The patch on his chest read, President. His name was Roy Calder, and he had ridden 200 miles since before dawn. He walked to the chapel door, removed his cap, and stood before the people of the town, with his hands folded. "My name is Roy," he said. His voice was a low gravel rumble that carried without effort. "Most of you don't know me. None of you owe me a thing. I came to tell you what your neighbor did because he can't, and because you ought to know who you buried." The mourners did not move. 11 days ago, on the road south of here, one of my men went down. He'd been run off that road on purpose by a man who wanted what wasn't his. My man told the stranger who found him not to call for help, because help meant police, and police meant a report. And a man like my man learns young that a report is just a slower way to lose. The stranger heard him, and the stranger ignored him. A sound moved through the chapel lot, low and immediate. He pulled my man out of the gravel with his own hands and saved his life, Roy said. He had been a deputy 31 years. 31 years of doing it by the book, of filling out the report and calling it in and letting the system have its say. He knew exactly what the law would have wanted him to do on that road, down to the form number. And he knew exactly what a dying man needed instead. And he chose the man. He gave a stranger the shirt off his own back in the cold, and he chose the man. That alone we would ride 1,000 miles to honor. That alone is more than most men do in a life. But that is not the whole of it, and you deserve to hear the whole of it. Roy let the silence sit. Somewhere in the formation, an engine ticked as it cooled. No one else made a sound. Your neighbor had spent his last years on the job, watching the same man who ran my brother off the road buy his way through every honest thing this county had, and he kept a record. Quiet in a box, in a closet, under his wife's quilts. He never used it, because a record in the hands of one tired old man is just a private grief. But he gave it to us, and we put it where it couldn't be bought. The man who thought he owned this county is finding out this week that he owns nothing the truth can reach. In the back of the lot, almost unnoticed, Esther Vance put her hand over her mouth. "That land my brothers bought 40 years ago, the riverbank that fellow wanted. It's safe now. It's safe because of a man none of us met until 11 days ago who asked us for nothing and who didn't live long enough to see what he said right." Roy's jaw tightened. "So we came, 75 of us, to stand at the back of his church and ride at the front of his road and make sure that this town knows it, buried a better man than it had any idea." He stepped back and he bowed his head, and 75 men. The service that followed was the town's own, the hymns it always sang, and the words the pastor always said. But it was lifted now, charged with a thing it had not had an hour before. People who had come to mourn a quiet neighbor understood that they had been living beside a man who, given a dark road and a dying stranger and a choice, had chosen right when no one was watching, and had gone on choosing right when it cost him his peace, and had asked for nothing in return but the chance to fix one true thing before he ran out of time. When it was over, they carried Walt out into the cold, bright morning, and the riders were already mounted. 75 engines idling low in a sound that came up through the soles of everyone's shoes. The hearse pulled out onto Halsey Road, and the formation took its place around it without a word of instruction, as if they had done it 100 times, 2 abreast in front and 2 abreast behind, and a wall of them down each flank, escorting a country undertaker's slow black car the way they would have escorted one of their own brothers to the ground. The sound of it filled the whole valley, rolling off the ridges and back again. Farmers who had heard the news came out to their fence lines with their hats in their hands to watch it pass. An old woman on a porch swing stood up. Children at a bus stop went silent. The procession ran nearly a mile from the first bike to the last, and it moved at the pace of grief, unhurried, dignified, impossible to mistake for anything but exactly what it was, which was a debt being carried in the open down a public road for a whole county to see. Nobody in that town would ever forget the sound of it. Years later, they would still be telling it, the morning the riders came for Walt Brennan, and the telling would always end the same way, with the listener asking how many, and the teller saying 75, and the listener not quite believing it, and the teller saying, "I counted, I was there." Gerald Lindfist did not see it. By the morning of the funeral, he had stopped leaving his house. The state attorney general had opened a formal inquiry, the kind that does not close in a day, no matter whose name is over the courthouse door. Two of the boards he sat on had quietly removed his name from their letterhead. The federal agency had sent a letter that used the word audit. Delahart, who ran the small weekly out of a storefront and whom he had never bothered to threaten, had put 11 years of dates on her front page in a plain column that anyone could follow, and once the dates were lined up, they could not be unlined, and the courthouse was now discussing, in low voices, whether his name ought to come off the wing he had paid to have it carved into. He had spent a lifetime building an armor of money and connection and carved stone, layer on layer, certain that enough of it would make him a different kind of man than the one he had started as. And in the space of a single week, the armor had turned out to be exactly as thick as the first honest question asked all at once, and no thicker. He sat in a glass house above the river he had wanted to own, watching nothing, returning no calls, the phone gone quiet in his hand. A man stripped down at last to the size he had always actually been, which was small. All of that was happening somewhere else, in the flat, clean light of a world that no longer wanted him. It is not the image this story ends on. The procession wound out past Miller's Orchard, past the curve below it, where a stranger had once knelt in the gravel with a flannel shirt pressed to a dying man's leg, and onto the small cemetery on the hill where Walt's wife had waited 9 years for him under a stone with room left on it for his name. They laid him beside her. The pastor said the last words into the cold wind, and the wind took most of them, and it did not seem to matter, because the people there had already heard the words that counted, and those had come in a low gravel rumble from a bearded stranger on the chapel steps. Tully was there at the back, limping, leaning hard on a cane, his bad leg stiff in the cold, when the last words had been said, and the town had begun slowly to drift back down the hill toward its cars and its casseroles. Tully stayed. He waited until the others had moved off, and the hilltop was his alone, and then he limped up to the fresh grave. He did not say anything. He was not a man with words for a moment like this, and Walt had not been a man who needed them. Tully reached into the pocket of his cut and took out the small folded square of flannel that Esther had cut away from his leg that first night, the bandage a stranger had made from the shirt off his own back. He had kept it. He did not fully know why, until now. He knelt with some difficulty, and he set it down at the base of the headstone, and he weighted it there with a stone from the riverbank that was safe now, that would stay scrub and gravel, and an old metal-roofed clubhouse for as long as any of them drew breath. Then he stood and he looked a long while at the two names on the stone, and the wind came up the hill cold and clean off the water below. It smelled like rain coming and turned earth, and the faint far ghost of exhaust still hanging in the valley air. It smelled like a debt paid in the only currency that ever mattered. Tully put his hand flat on the cold granite for a moment, the way you would lay a hand on a brother's shoulder, and then he turned and limped back down the hill to where his bike was waiting, and he rode out west with the rest of them, into a low afternoon sun, leaving the quiet man to his quiet hill, no longer a man any town would ever again forget. If this story moved you, if you believe that the measure of a person is what they do on a dark road when no one is watching and no reward is coming, take a moment to sit with that today. Tell someone about a quiet person in your own life who chose right without being asked. They are out there in every town, fixing fences and bringing soup and keeping records nobody thanks them for. Thank you for riding this road with us all the way to the hill. And if these stories mean something to you, stay close and we will tell you another.